And the only matter of business that we've got, because we are, of course, a creature of the General Assembly, so we don't do annual general meetings or anything silly like that, is to introduce you to John Lloyd here, who's a very eminent journalist. And I've got a little bit of paper that'll keep you busy for 5 minutes, but very in summary, he's been a journalist now, he tells me, since 1976, when he joined the Financial Times. And he specializes in special subjects for the Financial Times. He also has co-founded what is known as the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. So we really, please bow as you go out. And he's director of the Access, a program on journalism and democracy. He's a member of the editorial board of Prospect, chairman of the Moscow School of Political Studies, I hope that's a safe job, and a columnist for La Repubblica of Rome. And he's won many awards for journalism. He's a specialist writer of the year in the British Press Awards and journalist of the year in the Granada What the Papers Say Awards. And he's got a whole line of books to his credit. But without going through them, if you're interested in them, they appear on the piece of paper that I've got in front of my hand, which is on my stall. So do come and collect it. I don't know whether our bookstall is selling them, but hopefully you can easily get them. Please, now let's find out what is fake news. John.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to see you. I was told by my hosts, who are downbeat about these things, that there was much competition today, especially from one of your ministers who was talking about the flight from reason to emotion. And I want to, myself, without treading on his toes, go into that area later on. Before I talk about fake news as such, I wanted to give a bit of background to it. I went recently to a performance of Iolanthe, which those of you who, like me, like Gilbert and Sullivan, will know it's the story which brings together judges, parliament, and fairies. Fairies of the winged kind, and the genius of W.S. Gilbert as a storyteller brings them all together and seems to work. I'm very fond of Gilbert and Sullivan. It comes a bit from my youth. I grew up in Scotland, in one of the fishing villages on the east coast of Scotland, East Fife. And my mother was the local beautician. She spent her time piercing ears and ripping off people's eyebrows, so the house was full of cries of pain for much of the day. My mother being enthusiastic but sketchy in her approach to beauty. She was also, of course, given that her clients were all women, she was the center for gossip. It was Gossip Central. And every year she would go and do the makeup for the East Fife Amateur Operatic Society. And they put on, excuse me, as their title implied, an opera or operetta every year, many of which were Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert and Sullivan were then generally popular throughout the UK, including in Scotland, though it's very, very English. So I would see local people whom I knew in the street dressed up as whatever they might be dressed up as, singing songs like, in a broad Scots accent, from HMS Pinafore, I think, "For he is an English man," without any obvious irony. Enthused by this, excuse me, I asked, since I was a would-be journalist even in my mid-teens, I asked the editor of the local paper, a man called Carl Russell, who edited, sub-edited, reported, printed, and distributed the East Fife Observer, otherwise known as the 2 minutes silence. And proposed myself as cub reporter. And I would write things, and also I wanted to cover the arts. Since there was one performance a year, it wasn't a big job, but I also covered, there was a theatre some 10 miles away in St Andrews, which was the nearest big town, big university town. And one day I got a story, actually via my mother, which was about fishing and a conflict within the fishing community, about the market and sales and prices and so on. And I rushed to the East Fife Observer and said to Mr. Russell, I've got this tremendous story, rehearsed it to him, and he said, no, laddie, I can't use that. And I said, well, but Mr. Russell, it's true. And he said, that's the problem. And it wasn't in either of our minds a joke. It was that it was true meant that there was a real conflict on. The story was largely correct. And that the conflict, had it appeared in the East Fife Observer, would, in his view, have been made worse, because it would have become public, and the various components of the individuals who were part of this conflict would have to take sides. They were made public. A skipper would have taken a position. A fish merchant would have taken a position. And having done so, compromise and discussion would have been more difficult. And that was his view. He didn't put it quite like that, but that was his view. And of course he was right. And it remained in my mind ever since. Actually, it was part of the reason why I, with others, founded this centre in Oxford to discuss the issues of ethics and other issues for contemporary journalism. Because although the function of journalism, especially as it's passed on to journalists, and especially since the last war, and more especially since Watergate, which privileged investigative reporting, digging below the surface, finding things out which had been hidden or were not known to most people. When that happened, then every aspiring journalist wanted to be a Woodward or a Bernstein. They wanted to bring down the President of the United States, as they assisted in doing it. What would have happened to Nixon, but more slowly. But they certainly played a large part in doing so, and of course that was made much of by the Washington Post, which was where they worked. But that communities, and this was after all a quite small communities, small towns, villages of 2,000, 2,500 people around the coast, dependent on fishing then, not nearly so much now, were places where there were real politics about the economy, conditions, wages, and so on, but were settled by discussion and to some extent also by the local council. Each of these villages had its own council. Now it's amalgamated into North East Fife Council, but then they had councils. Indeed, in the town I lived, which was the largest, they had 3 councils for the villages which had existed and had come together in the last century. So that journalism was essential for democracy, which is what we journalists claim, has seemed to me to be both correct, because when you go to undemocratic countries or authoritarian countries, where I have lived in the Soviet Union and Central Europe, and they were still communist, then you could see the difference, because the press and the television news and so on was commanded by the party, by the Communist Party, and gave a very, very distorted view of the news, or at least a very narrow view of the news, and much like natural disasters, air crashes, and so on, were simply not referred to, or referred to weeks after they'd happened. So it is true that a free press and a free journalism is part of a democratic state, but it also has its other side too. It can often, as it were, displace community and local bargaining and compromise, and that was the interest in exploring journalism, founding the Reuters Institute, and in writing a book which came out last year, now available in good bookshops, or indeed bad bookshops, called The Power and the Story. And that is an attempt to give a picture of what's happening in journalism in the world. Got grants and was able to travel a good deal, talk to journalists everywhere, both in authoritarian countries and in democratic countries, and wrote this book over time. And that informs what I wanted to say. I wanted to say three things mainly. One, that there is a real division between authoritarianism and democracy. Won't be news to you, but it's worth emphasizing that because it's quite often these days blurred. People tend to say, well, really politicians everywhere are all the same. Democracy very often doesn't work. There's a bit of a crisis now in democracy. You have an authoritarian country like China, which is zooming ahead, where the president has just elected himself for life, or had himself elected by the Communist Party conference for life, had his thoughts read into the Constitution so that the Constitution actually reflects his view of what should happen in the country. But the country has been wildly successful in bringing people out of grinding peasant poverty, starvation, even deep into the 80s, the Maoist period of enormous hunger and suppression, and indeed huge millions and millions died because of the Great Leap Forward, so-called, into, when you go there, and probably many of you have, seen, at least in the cities, a bustling, relatively successful, indeed very successful from what it had been, modern country, an authoritarian country. In Russia, also authoritarian, much less successful, dependent wholly upon oil and gas, and hence when the price went down, as it did until the last year, it suffered and has not modernized, is different from the Soviet Union. There are greater freedoms than from the Soviet Union, but still is not yet a successful country. In these authoritarian countries, in China, in Russia, in most of the Middle Eastern countries, now in Turkey, and in many of the East Asian states, Southeast Asian states, and in many African countries, you have a journalism which is controlled mainly by the government, to a lesser extent by companies, corporations, which in authoritarian countries usually look over their shoulder very carefully at the government and what the state is doing, because they work, as it were, privately only by license from the state. The same is true in China, the same is true in Russia, in Turkey, in Egypt, where I spent some time, and now where under President El-Sisi, there is a very, very authoritarian country, more authoritarian than it had been in the past before the so-called Arab Spring. And that's been true elsewhere. In China, in Russia, Turkey, and elsewhere, you had a window for the Arab Spring, for the period in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when President Yeltsin was president, chaotic, but relatively free. And in China, before Xi Jinping came to power, there had been about 10 years in which journalism and indeed politics could be discussed much more openly. Journalism became more probing into the many, many problems that rapid development gave. You had a different kind of approach to society. Now it has been clamped down. So that's the authoritarian world and its media. In the democratic world, it's more diverse. So that democratic world would include India, as soon to be the world's largest state by population, much of Europe, North America, much of South America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and a few others. That's what we count as democratic. And as sorry? UK? I forgot about the UK. I took it for granted. the UK as well. This is fuzzy around the borders because democracy is fungible this way and that. Can you call Hungary and Poland now, which have become much more conservative and authoritarian, still democracies? I think you probably can, but conservative, even slightly authoritarian countries. It includes Italy, which is where my wife is from and where she still teaches at university, where the man who seems to be made of India rubber because he always bounces back, Silvio Berlusconi, owned much of the, or many of the outlets, both television and especially magazines and a couple of newspapers. And so that when he was prime minister, he controlled his own 3 major channels and also the 3 state channels of RAI, the public service broadcaster. So clearly, while it remained a democracy, people voted against him. Books were written criticizing him, newspaper articles were written, TV shows and so on. It's a democracy, but it was one which was, I would say, wounded a bit by him and by his being in power. And then there are the places where democracy exists, but the danger signs are there. That may be true almost everywhere because the constant toing and froing between politics and journalism means that journalism sometimes loses as it thinks, politics sometimes loses as they think, but some equilibrium is usually kept. But take South Africa, which after Nelson Mandela's extraordinary presidency and his extraordinary presence, that someone like he who had been a prisoner for decades should come out and preach a politics of forgiveness and of coming together, did set the tone for South Africa, but has not, one can say, been strongly followed. Indeed, the just former president Zuma is now facing corruption charges, as indeed is the president of Brazil. In South Africa, you still have a very free press, critical press. Broadcasting is more or less controlled. But whether or not the press can remain free and can remain critical isn't still an open question. It was very much an open question under President Zuma's presidency. At the moment, it may be safer, but no one really knows. In Central Europe, I've mentioned Hungary and Poland, where although still there are opposition media, they are under great pressure, often because the state has not just stopped funding them insofar as they were public, but also has made sure that advertisers don't advertise on them, and hence they've squeezed very much the opposition media, and although still formally democratic, democracy has suffered a great deal. So when I said it was fuzzy around the edges, that's a nice way of saying democracy and free media are in some danger. It's a kind of very sketchy international view of how the media are working now or not working. And within that, we have the crisis, which many people think it is, of fake news. And by talking about fake news, one comes to the presidency of Donald Trump, who is the man who has most popularized fake news. Indeed, the phrase, while probably not invented by him, nevertheless has been so used by him that it's become a central issue in public discourse everywhere, including here. It's extraordinary that it should come from an American president, because American media, American journalism has led the world, especially since the war. And I instanced before Watergate and the charge that gave to investigative journalism. And I say it's led the world because it's done two things. One, it has insisted as the First Amendment of the American Constitution has it, that speech and publication and religion should be free, which comes, of course, from the founding of America and the founding fathers. They all were fathers who had come from or were descended from people who had come from a monarchy, this country, and who wanted to break away, to found their own country, and found it on the basis of freedom. The fact that there should be millions of slaves in the south of America was a problem, but one which for many, many years, indeed for decades, they preferred not to notice. Or at least some did, not all. Others did notice and fought against it, but the institution remained still for another more than 100 years after the founding of the United States. The freedom they gave to journalism meant that at the same time as Europe, the old continent, was still taxing, as in this country, still taxing newspapers and news sheets in order to keep them out of the hands of the masses, who might be dangerous if they were educated. In America, it was quite different. The state itself paid for the transmission of newspapers through the post so that as many people as possible could read. Those of you who are fans of Western films will know that in many of them, the local editor, the Carol Russell 2-minute silence version of in America, is usually a hero. He usually stands up against the villains, the bandits, the cattle owners who are trying to drive out the sharecroppers. He is a man, usually is a man, indeed I think always a man, stands up for the common person, the little person, because that's the role, as they saw it, of journalism. And that's been true for 200 years and more. So that American president should so launch himself against the news media and against journalism as Donald Trump has, seeing it together with the FBI, which is investigating him, and the CIA, and of course Democrats and others, seeing it as a major enemy, not just an institution which criticizes him as it's criticized every president before, but as an enemy which should be put down, which he's vowed vengeance upon, though as yet nothing has come, is an extraordinary thing. It's not extraordinary to see it in authoritarian countries, indeed it's normal. But to see it in the United States, not just a democracy, but in the case of journalism, the one which has led, which has insisted upon freedom, which has been the most careful certainly in newspapers, but also in broadcasting, in getting the facts right. Often getting them wrong, but still trying to get the facts right. Journalism always gets facts wrong because it's so rapid, and it's more and more rapid now because instead of just being daily, it's hourly. Nevertheless, what they try to do is to get it right, and if wrong, to apologize. That's been the American gift, I think, to journalism around the world. When I was living in Russia, and before in Central Europe, the former communist countries, when communism left, the journalists there looked to America as role models and tried to pick up from what the Americans had done. What President Trump says of that which he doesn't like in the press, which is a great deal, is that it's fake news. It's put there by people who wish to denigrate him, who are his enemies, and who use anything at all, lies, as he usually terms the stories, in order to damage his presidency. That is fake news. In fact, much of the fake news that was done in the campaign was directed at Hillary Clinton. not necessarily cooked up by the Trump campaign, but what happened then was that because fake news depends very much on social media and the internet, talented people, often living in Bosnia or Georgia, not Georgia, America, but the former Soviet state, young people, young men and women who had excellent English would write stories which would then be inserted into the web, usually about Hillary Clinton doing this or that, illegally, and these would be circulated, and sometimes got lots and lots of different hits, and did her some harm. It's impossible to know if that actually meant that she lost, although of course she got more votes nationally than Trump did, but she lost because she lost the states, the main states. Possible to know if that was the main factor, or the fake news circulated by Russians was also a major factor. Nevertheless, she lost, and presumably it did play a part. His side of politics created much more fake news than the other side, although the other side also began to fight back against the Republican right, but probably too late. That this should be now coming out and should be a major factor in journalism today and in democracy today is to a large, very considerable extent due to Donald Trump. One has to say that because it's been, certainly from the point of view of a journalist, it's been the most negative factor in this whole fake news debate. It's been picked up by others elsewhere. It's been picked up by President Erdogan in Turkey, by President El-Sisi in Egypt, by President Putin in Russia, by Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, when he's under pressure now because of alleged corruption charges, by people in authoritarian states, people in South American states, including Lula da Silva, who's now being charged with corruption himself. Those in power, under pressure from the media, reach for fake news in order to muddy the waters. The final point to make is that fake news is not new. Indeed, and this comes back to the issue of reason and emotion. We did at the Reuters Institute some years ago, we did a series of focus groups to find out what people knew about the news. And they were done by a group of academics at Leeds University, and there were quite a lot of focus groups by people from all walks of life came in. They were asked a series of questions, and as focus groups do, conversed freely about their view of the news and what they knew and what they didn't know. And this was really some years ago, and it was at the time when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were both vying for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. So within the Democratic Party, they were head-to-head for some months trying to get that all-important nomination, which of course Obama got and won the presidency. Of the 20 focus groups that were done, when people talked about the American elections to come, not one person, not one, knew that there was a competition in the Democratic Party between these two people, between Obama and Clinton. Everyone thought they were vying for the presidency. And yet it was on the news most nights, it was in the papers most days, it was on the radio news, so on. Now, one can say, well, there you go. I mean, we're not in America, we don't have to know about American politics, and so what? But it does show that people who probably watch the news or listen to it or read it at times are not taking it in, are not sure of what it means. And the deeper you go into that, and there's been some studies on this, the more you understand that news, except that which actually means something to people, passes most people by. And one of the reasons for it, and it's not a bad reason in a sense, is what can we do about it? What can we do about the horrors of Syria? What can we do about the takeover of power by Xi Jinping? What can we do about fake news, about the invasion of privacy by Facebook and by the people it employs? What can we do in our daily life? And one of the things I think about civil society, in which I know that many of you are engaged and think about, is that that question has to be asked and answered by, we can do something. We can do something because we are citizens, and as a citizen, we can do something. The organization, the Russian organization that I'm chairman of, which can no longer work in Russia, is called the School of Civic Education, and the idea is that it teaches people who have come out of a country in which democracy and civil society really didn't exist, not just under communism, but under Tsarism before that, for centuries. Russians had no experience of democracy and therefore of a civil society where they themselves could create institutions, except very briefly, perhaps, a little bit before the revolution of 1917. Civil society means space in which politics doesn't command. It can, of course, be discussed, and very often is discussed, but it doesn't command. The state doesn't have a purview over it. And that's an extraordinarily important thing to recognize. We can do something, even if it's small. And for fake news, we can expose it. It does mean having to be alert about it, having to see where it operates, but we can expose it. But we also have to recognize, I think, that for most people, there is a part of the mind which, if you like, is reserved for unreality, for non-scientific facts. People of faith very often reserve quite a large part of their feelings, thoughts, and so on, for things which are not scientifically provable or indeed are scientifically impossible. Again, knowing Italy somewhat, I've always been struck by the power of the various cults in the country, which are essentially Catholic, not always approved by the Catholic Church, of which the most powerful is that of Padre Pio, who was a priest in Puglia in the south of Italy, who was a man who claimed to have done or to have witnessed miracles. I think he was made a saint. I'm not sure about that. I think he was made a saint by the previous pope. And people, millions of people, remain under his spell, if you will, and believe in his miracles. Believe that he healed people, believe that he had a direct line to Christ or to God, and believed that what, in some cases has been proven, could not happen, did happen. In other words, they believe part of their makeup, part of their life, part of the reason why they get up in the morning is that they have a strong belief in something which is simply unprovable or even factually impossible. Now that's, to a degree at least, an extreme example, but it's an example which is followed throughout, that most people need something else, something other than the facts. The Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot wrote, I think in The Wasteland, that humankind cannot bear too much reality. And I think that's true. That most of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, needs quite a lot of unreality. Even if it's only burying oneself in a fiction, a novel, or something of that kind, or a TV series. Then you then come out, you're the same person, but you're back to reality. Fake news has always been has always played upon that, and has played upon it in the past much more than it does now. For much of the past, the newspapers, before television or even when television came, were either commanded by states which put out fake news in order to bolster their own authority, or, in democracies, allowed, because they were democratic and allowed free speech and free discussion, allowed cults like Padre Pios to exist because people wished them to, not because the state had created them, but because they were wished into existence and wished into continued existence because they were part of people's desires. News, journalism of the factual kind, the kind that I've done for much of my life, depends upon people believing in a series of facts, believing in a narrative which you, the journalist, puts together, which says this happened, and then that caused this to happen, that had this effect, and in the end, this was the conclusion. In other words, you're making up a story, but unlike a novelist or a short story writer, you're making up a story which you claim, the newspaper claims, the journalist claims, is correct. That kind of reason of this happened, then that happened, then that happened, and we can prove it. We can prove it because we asked people what happened, we saw what happened, there is evidence that it happened, is now under quite a lot of pressure. It's under a lot of pressure in part because fake news is pushing at it, in part, I think, because we are now increasingly, as societies, societies actually both authoritarian and democratic, are privileging sentiment over reason. That reason becomes, if not unpopular, suspect. Why is it better to think, to reason, to have a rational series of events and a narrative about it? Why is that better than the feeling that one gets? And increasingly, as one watches television or listens to the radio, what is being privileged in interviews and in correspondence reports is a feeling. How do you feel about it? Now, it's perfectly legitimate to ask the question, and all of us have emotions which sometimes overwhelm us and which indeed keep us going. But within journalism, where the balance was always had to be made between reason and emotion, the balance is tipping that way, and therefore privileges, supports the greater existence of fake news. As I say, it hasn't overwhelmed us. Our society, this society, operates, you may disagree, more or less well, but it certainly operates a lot better than many, many other states. But the danger, I suppose, is that in this society, as in others, we increasingly lose the track of what constitutes a rational explanation for behavior, a rational explanation underpinning our politics, our economics, and our society. And down that road, if that's the way we go, lies, I think, a considerable danger, one which people like yourselves, active in civil society, people like the Russians that I work with in the School of Civic Education, need to combat, and can, because as citizens, or in the case of Russians, would-be citizens, that's our job. So thank you.